Hey everybody, thanks as always for stopping by. So today I wanted to talk about a subject that's very near and dear to me. I've actually been quite vocal about this subject since October 7th. You can probably guess what I'm about to talk about with what's going on in Palestine. That's been on other social media platforms mainly, but since I've rebooted this channel towards the beginning of the year, I've really made a point to read a lot more stuff about what's going on over there. And so today, I wanted to frame my discussion of Palestine around this book here. All right, so we're talking about Justice for Some, written by Noura Erakat, subtitled Law and the Question of Palestine. This was written, I'd say, about 5 years ago, so again, not terribly up to date, but certainly relevant. So much has happened since October 7th. And so everybody here in Booktube and just anyone interested in what's going on over there is just chomping at the bit for anything new coming out of there in the way of a book or documentaries and things like that. And we got some stuff trickling through the pipeline, but most of the stuff is obviously predating October 7th. I'm finding it's hard to find anything sort of after 2022 at the library because everybody has been going there for some of the main titles. We've all heard of the titles like, the 100 Years War on Palestine. Everyone's talking about Alain Pape or Pape. I'm not sure how to say his name. I've only ever read it. Noam Chomsky and sort of a lot of the same people. I think what's most relevant right now is basically anything certainly after 2008. And even you could go back as early as 2005 and 2006, when Hamas started taking over Gaza, when they were elected in. And we can even go back to 2005, 2006, when Israel, they didn't abandon their occupation, of course, but they left Gaza towards the peripheries and imposed that devastating blockade that has carried on to this day. That's really important modern history, right? And of course, you can go back much earlier. I mean, it's useful to know what happened after 1947 with the partition at the UN, and 1948 with declaring statehood with Israel, and even before that, to World War I, when Sykes-Picot, really started this whole thing off with being under the British mandate. And there's always been the Palestine question in the context of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So there's a lot of places where we can pick up in modern history to figure out what the hell has gone on over there. And while there is the appearance of complexity in this topic, when it comes to bombing hospitals and waging a genocide specifically against women and babies, the question becomes very simple, especially in terms of international law. But yeah, there is a lot to know about what has happened since, let's just arbitrarily set our starting point at 1916, 1917. That's where most of the history is so important to understand. This book is very sweeping. It takes a look at, as you can tell by the subtitle, the law, how international law and the legal frameworks that have evolved over that time period that I just laid out has impacted, what's going on in Palestine and the conflict. Noura Erakat is an extremely accomplished woman. I mean, she comes from a lineage, a family that is very involved in Palestinian politics, with her uncle being a very long-serving negotiator. He's done a lot for the cause. Noura Erakat herself is a human rights attorney and assistant professor at George Mason University. Oh, she's done so many things, for refugee rights at the UN. And she's also a frequent commentator on CBS and CNN and Fox News and NPR. And her writings have been widely published. So I think she's an important voice. As I went through this book, I was really impressed by the scholarship of it. She's obviously extremely knowledgeable. And she does not come across as ideologically possessed or anything like that. The main things that come up are the sui generis status in international law with which Palestine has been handled for many, many reasons. Britain brought their case, and they soon learned, as they have with so many escapades that Britain has been a part of, that they're really in out of their depth. And so they ask the international community to weigh into this. and they extended sui generis status to the Palestine question. They didn't really have any framework to capture the unique complexities of there being, fairly rigid boundaries of where Palestine started and ended. Of course, there were certain blur areas around the peripheries and linguistic and religio concerns that made up the demographics. But Palestine was an entity for a long time. I mean, for heaven's sakes, it even shows up in the litter of Shakespeare and many dating back centuries. So the denial that Palestine ever existed that's been debunked. They had a currency, there were people living there, there was a thriving metropolitan culture in certain areas, particularly Jaffa and of course the Old City. And so the question becomes, Britain made a lot of commitments to early Zionists. They made a lot of commitments in terms of how they were going to handle Palestine in the context of, maintaining some sort of contiguous Arab identity and Muslim identity, and capturing all of that with really a duplicitous and contradictory commitment to Jewish settlers. And so Zionists, especially as we wander after the World War II era and Israel starts to pursue statehood, the question becomes, what are the relevant international laws that Israel is going to hold itself to? And that was the occupation law. And then, of course, with the Geneva Conventions, Israel really started to intensify their lawfare, that is, legal warfare and legal opportunism at the international level. What they were willing to commit themselves to, because obviously the Geneva Conventions were much more comprehensive and put Israel in very sticky terrain. I mean, it was already sticky to begin with, but now that many of their activities began to be seen as criminal at the international level, their main sort of retreat was into occupation law. And they didn't even hold up that side of the bargain particularly well. And so this whole conversation surrounding the sui generis nature of Palestine, as it becomes even more and more sophisticated when Palestine starts adhering itself to, the Rome Statute and kind of observer status. And the argument she puts forward is that Palestinian sovereignty has been so unbelievably encroached upon, and it's dead letter, really. Unless you have some real international activism shutting down Israel and its activities, kind of like what we saw with South Africa, unless something along those lines happens, Palestinian sovereignty is not. It's extremely a lost cause at this point. And so she says we need to redouble our rhetoric and our activism towards the civil liberties front. And she, borrows a lot from American history with the Black struggle, as far as like, this is how we can really affect the most good given the shitty situation that we find ourselves in. So that's the main sort of thrust of this book, and I think she argues that really well. The whole book it touches on so many things, and how Palestine has done remarkably well and asserting itself as a dominant human rights cause in the Parliament of Man. I was especially impressed by the sophisticated nature of their arguments, with how intelligent Palestine has deported itself in these bodies, especially given some of the sloppy and opportunistic arguments that Israel and the United States has routinely put forward. Palestine not only has a very just cause, they're certainly not just going to center it on the more, what would you say, emotional aspects. They're willing to go the whole way and meet elitists at their level. I was just so impressed and inspired by some of these lawyers, how much fortitude Palestinians have demonstrated throughout this struggle. While it's an incredibly dismal topic, there is a line, I think this is in a future book I'll be reviewing. The author says, the one thing that Palestinians basically count on is that tomorrow is going to be worse than today. And as you read through this history at any level, whether we're talking, litigation, or we're talking on the ground, the bottom-up resistance, that seems to be the case. We went from a place where Israel wouldn't even acknowledge that there was a Palestine beforehand, to following the First Intifada and under Arafat, how much respect that he won for the Palestinian cause, domestically, but also at the international level. I would say from the mid 80s to the early 90s, there was a lot of optimism about what Palestine could accomplish along with their allies. Of course, that optimism soon disappeared, I would say within the first 5 years of Oslo I, but especially by Oslo II, there was nothing to be hopeful for. Arafat was seen in the public eye as not really capable of coming to any agreement. Well, I mean, that's very obvious. Oslo was tremendously one-sided in favor of Israel and the United States. You can understand sort of the defeatist approach that Arafat came to assume, by the end of Clinton's presidency. In fact, I read last year Bill Clinton's memoir, and he spends actually quite a bit of time speaking about the Oslo negotiations, and there's this really dramatic part at the end of that story where he's just about to leave office, and he's having a conversation with Arafat, and he says, "You have made me a failure," and Arafat was actually quite civilized to him and complimentary, and said, "You've done a lot," even though that he got screwed in a big way along with Palestine. But he was civil enough to say thank you for everything that you've done. And Bill Clinton throws in his face and says, "Well, you've made me a failure. We could have made a deal." And it's like, look at what you were offering. Like, you weren't offering anything of tangible import for Palestinians. Okay, sure, maybe small things like they can wave their flag, as opposed to beforehand when, that was actually illegal. And all you could really show was like the watermelon. That's where the watermelon has such significance. If you're very active online, you'll see the watermelon represents Palestine. Well, it's because for many years that was the only way they could express their nationalist identity and interests. So yeah, okay, there were some concessions, but give me a break. Like, we're going to need a little more than just being able to wave a flag, you know what I mean? And small concessions of that variety. Palestine acknowledged the existence of Israel, said that they were condemning any acts of violence towards Israel, but of course they have to hold up their end of the bargain, and they have to start giving some sovereignty to the Palestinians, and they wouldn't make any concessions in that direction. So of course that negates the acknowledgement at the onset of Oslo. We're talking like in the early 90s now. Obviously that negates the one veto that Palestine can flaunt from time to time, which is resistance. If you're not going to make any peaceful, viable negotiations, what's left? There's violence. That's it. And actually, she speaks a lot about that too, in terms of Nelson Mandela and how, there's a lot of things to be said for nonviolent resistance, sort of more Gandhian, although that's been, misrepresented as well. Gandhi wasn't a pure pacifist, if you really look at the arguments that he puts forward, but he was more pacifist than, I would say, Nelson Mandela. And so Nelson Mandela coming online with this conception that, like, what do we have in the breakdown of talk? There's talk, and then there's violence. And yes, the violence can be carried out in precision ways and principled ways, but it's going to happen. You can't just say, oh, well, this is Muslim extremism or whatever. They're acting in self-defense. Doesn't mean that I personally can endorse everything that, groups like Hamas have done, but I can definitely say that there is a place for violent resistance in the context of what Israel has done. I mean, we extend all of that to Israel, don't we? Even though they are the ultimate aggressors, even though they are the routine criminals in this situation. I mean, at least Palestine had, by Oslo, been prepared to give up some land and say, yeah, you kind of moved in your furniture, right? You've moved in your furniture. We're not going to make you take down or sell off all of your skyscrapers in Tel Aviv. Obviously. Like, you're here to stay. We get it. But at the same time, respect international law and quit expansion of settlements and move back to the agreed upon pre-1967 lines. It's a pretty straightforward deal. So Noura Erakat really captures all of that. I would like to talk to you guys lower in the comments. Maybe you've read this book, or maybe you intend to. Maybe you know Noura Erakat. I would love to chat with you down there and speak about some of the more nitty-gritty details of their legal fight. But I can't remember what I rated this. If it wasn't 5 stars, it was close. Definitely 4 stars. So heavily recommended. And if you got a little bit of a law head, you enjoy that sort of thing as I do, you'll love it. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you in the next one. Hey everyone, I hope you liked this video. If you want more like the one you just watched, click the suggested video on this screen. Make sure you subscribe, and to connect with me on my other platforms, my handles are linked below in the description, alright? Take care, peeps. Till next time.